I am sure that if you ask supporters of both political parties, they will share popular beliefs and generalizations about each other, which they hold to be the gospel truths ordained. That's the truth. To make my point, Mr. Speaker, I will share with you two common generalizations that factually are really political myths which should be relegated to the dustbins of history. And I'm going to play it safe by using two drawn from our own political party. One such myth is that crime always increases under the SLP because the SLP is soft on crime. You hear it all the time. Another is that the SLP only cares about workers and the poor, not the middle class or middle class professionals. So pervasive is this latter characterization that the Minister of Finance was moved, Mr. Speaker, at page 7 of his presentation, to declare quite rightly that, quote, this government continues to be guided and inspired by the philosophy and values of the founding fathers of our great party, the St. Lucia Labour Party, to open doors of opportunity for every St. Lucian, irrespective of their social and economic standing in the society. Our party originated from the bosom of the labor movement and has consistently served the best interests of the workers in this country. Unquote. And that summarizes a philosophical tenet of the Labour Party that all represent. And I am certain that this particular quote will resonate for a very long time today, Miss. Today, and of course, in the years to come. It's very well said. Today, Mr. Speaker, I plan to address one such pervasive myth. The myth that of the two political parties, the United Workers' Party is the best manager of the economy. And I believe you heard the member, the leader of the opposition, the member for Miku South. He's not disassociating himself from that view at all. I mean, in fact, I think that there's muted concurrence with it. I do so, Mr. Speaker, because the former administration led by the member for Miku South was a chief purveyor of that myth, even after the defeat of 2021. And, Mr. Speaker, I sat on the opposition benches in the last term as I heard the derision, the ridicule, the unkind remarks about the economy that was managed by the previous administration. I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, honorable members will recall some of the choice statements that were made on these occasions. But what was the reality, Mr. Speaker? I want to take the bold step of answering this, particularly as it concerns this budget presentation and, of course, the information that has been presented to us in the last few days. Let us look at the performance of the respective administrations. The Labour Party administration, led by yours truly, at one time the honourable member for the South, and of course the administration led by the former Prime Minister and now leader of the opposition member, also for Miku South. I will focus initially on these key indices: growth rates, debt-to-GDP ratios, fiscal operations. And after we have looked at these indices, we are then going to consider how the resources of the state were utilized. And already we have had pronouncements from individual members in their contributions to this House. So the remit is simple. Who really is the best manager of this economy? What does the historical record say? What does the historical record provide? Who can the people of St. Lucia continue to trust to manage this economy, to take us to the future that lies ahead of us? These are the sub-themes, the sub-topics, the sub-issues, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Let's first of all look at what the former Prime Minister and the member for Micoud South inherited in 2016. This is what they found. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, I have not wandered very far. I didn't go into my archives because, you know, these economic and social reviews, I do have problems with them sometimes, to be honest, and I've said so when I was on the opposition benches. That's not going to change. No, I do have issues with them, but I didn't go into my archives. I decided for the sake of simplicity to use this. So we are back in 2016. What was the inheritance? And we are looking at, Mr. Speaker, we are looking at the issue of growth rates. For the 5-year period, the growth rate recorded during the tenure of the former St. Lucia Labour Party government was minus 0.1 in 2012, minus 2.0 in 2013, 1.3 in 2014, 0.1 in 2015, and 3.4 in 2016. I have omitted the 4.3 growth rate in 2011 because a general election, of course, the United Workers' Party was then in office, because the general election was held in November of that year, and that growth rate properly belongs to the United Workers' Party of the member for Castries North. But we all know what happens subsequently, because the moment after that growth rate, the economy plunged, decelerated into decline. And I don't think the member for Castries North will ever dissent that this decline was partly explained by, of course, the settlement of the then wage bill. And in any event, this was the period when we engaged in some structural adjustment to better anchor the economy. And yes, we did. We introduced VAT in that period. Many will remember, of course, this. The growth rate of 2016 was also a shared year between the parties. But everyone knows that what was achieved in any particular year was determined by policies in the previous term. Now for the 5-year period of the United Workers' Party. The growth rate recorded during the tenure of the UWP under the guidance of the member for Micoud South was 3.4 in 2017, which, as you know, would have been created by the policies of 2016. 2.9 in 2018, minus 0.3 in 2019. And then we plunged precipitously to a whopping minus 25.4 in 2020. And of course returned to a growth of 12.2% in 2021. And Mr. Speaker, I am inviting you, I think, to look at page 91, where all of these statistics appear. So you're welcome to visit page 91 to confirm that I'm not propagating my own myth, but rather these are statistics from this. Now, let me enter a caveat. And there's no need for us to fight over this, you know, because it's time we have to grow up in politics. You know, I remember, Mr. Speaker, I remember the years when we had September 11th in the US and the economies were plunged into decline. No matter how I stood on the benches on the opposite side and explained the impact this had on tourism and the damage it caused the tourism sector, I was ridiculed roundly, not just by the then opposition, but of course by those interest groups in the society who felt that they had a shared interest in promoting the ideological interests of the then United Workers' Party. So in 2011, Mr. Speaker, that chapter was a different chapter. So for the 5-year period of the United Workers' Party, we have these growth rates, and in particular, the decline of 25.4% is directly, I wouldn't say directly, is partly attributably, partly explainable by, of course, what occurred with COVID. To be sure, as I said, Mr. Speaker, it is beyond doubt that COVID was largely responsible for this precipitous decline, but niggling questions remain. Why was the decline so severe? Why was St. Lucia the worst casualty in the OECS? And that's the niggling question. 3 points may be made, Mr. Speaker. First, the United Workers' Party in 2016 inherited an economy that had stabilized after the adjustments between 2011 and 2014 to introduce VAT and contain expenditure. By 2016, the economy had returned to growth, albeit tepidly, a little warm, but growth was there, and that's how it starts. In 2017, when the member from Migu South was Prime Minister and in office, after 1 year, the economy grew by 3.4%. And thereafter, growth decelerated rapidly. And that is another question. Why did growth begin to decelerate after a climb of 3.4? Secondly, in 2020, Mr. Speaker, as we said, growth declined by a whopping 25.4%, the most significant decline ever in the economic history of this country, worse than Hurricane Allen in 1979. Secondly, as I said earlier, it was the most dramatic decline in OECS. It is really pointless to blame it all on COVID. We're not going to get anywhere with that argument, even when we concede that COVID had some impact, some influence. I'll tell you why. It is true that by then our economy had developed tourism as its leading sector. And it was the sector that suffered the greatest damage from the onset of COVID. But the problem is that a country like Antigua has a similarly structured economy like ours these days, perhaps with the rider that we are slightly more diversified because of our manufacturing sector, which I suspect is a little stronger than that of Antigua. And of course we have some agriculture as well, some. And you know what has happened to agriculture's contribution to GDP in this economy? So the question is, why is it that they never experienced such a dramatic decline and we did? And as I said, we were a more diversified economy. Now, Mr. Speaker, what reasons can you proffer for this? What reasons can you give for this? But I leave the issue at large. I put it out at large, deliberately for the time being, Mr. Speaker, because the plan is to return to it at the appropriate time. The third point I wish to make, and I know this irritates the opposition intensely. It does irritate the opposition each time it is said. The United Workers' Party administration was the beneficiary of a twice rebased economy during its tenure. Every time I say that, they get upset. Every time. And I'm on record as saying the St. Lucia Labour Party has never had the benefit of a rebased economy. How the civil servants manage it, I don't even know to this day. How they get it done, I don't know, but we all welcome it. You know why, Mr. Speaker? We welcome it because it means major adjustments in the figures that are presented to the Honorable House. So if you had a lower growth rate in a particular year, a particular cycle, you may find that growth rate inching, a couple points up. But Mr. Speaker, it is well known that rebasing recorded higher measurable economic output will lead to a reduction in debt-to-GDP ratios. So if you have, for example, if your GDP increases, then what it does is that it allows some readjustment on your debt-to-GDP ratio, and perhaps even make your debt-to-GDP ratio looking a little better, whether, of course, by a couple of notches or otherwise. So it's always welcome. But you know, Mr. Speaker, I want to stick a pin here for the sake of history, for the sake of the moment, for the sake of the hour. Mr. Speaker, I pause to say that one of the highest, if not the highest, growth achieved after independence in a single year was 6.2% in 2006, achieved when the member for Beaufort South managed the economy. And I have a feeling it's higher than 6.2 because we have not got the rebase figures. I don't have access to the rebase figures, even if the Ministry of Finance suggested they may have been rebased. But I've always known it's 6.2 before rebasing. Be that as it may. No other Minister of Finance is yet to surpass that figure in normal times, though the omens look good for the current Minister of Finance to do so. And why do I say normal times? Simply, when an economy suffers a dramatic decline, as happened with COVID with us, you get a decline of 25.4%, or you get a hurricane that totally destroys your GDP, it is almost inevitably that once you begin to deal with the issues of recovery, you will see your growth developing by leaps and bounds. It's an inevitable process. Now, of course, they are taking sanctuary in that argument. They're taking sanctuary in that argument, and their response is, well, you know, you got a 25, you got an 18% growth rate, you got a 12, but it had to happen. In any event, attempting to deny the member for Castries is the skillful managing of the economy to have allowed room for that growth to take place. And you want to understand what I'm saying? You want to understand what you're saying? What I'm saying? Just like, Mr. Speaker, when the member for Migu South held the reins of the economy, he can't explain what he did, why the economy deteriorated so alarmingly and decelerated at the pace that it did prior to the entry of COVID. So, you get the next clue. When COVID came around, this economy was already in sharp decline. It had decelerated to the point that COVID delivered to it a lethal blow because of the management of the economy by the previous Minister of Finance. That's the reality, and so on. The economy did not have the pillars, it did not have the crutches, Mr. Speaker, that it needed to withstand the onslaught of COVID. And so we all had the indignity of a decline of 25.4% or thereabouts, some say 30%, Mr. Speaker. That's what in fact happened. And I'm not saying that the honorable member should have forecasted what would have happened, because we didn't expect the pandemic. But you know the problem is when you begin to explain the phenomenon, that's the issue. You have to take responsibility and you have to take liability. It is in your explanations that become critical and crucial. Of course, I would want that history. I would want that history to be treated as historical phenomena. But we cannot do so yet because the imputation still exists. The consequences, we are all feeling it today. And it is vital that our people understand what we are dealing with. So much then, Mr. Speaker, for growth rates. Let us now take a look at public debt GDP ratios. And for that, Mr. Speaker, I want you to see page 115 of the Economic Social Review for 2022. Look at it, Mr. Speaker. Now, let us contrast and look at the ratios. Mr. Speaker, take your time. Write it down if you want, if you must. In 2012, Mr. Speaker, The debt to GDP ratio for St. Lucia was 61.1%. In 2013, it was 62.2%. In 2014, it was 60.7%. In 2015, it was 61.5%. And remember, Mr. Speaker, I am looking at page 115 of the Economic and Social Review. These are not figures I am inventing, Mr. Speaker. These are not myths, Mr. Speaker. These are raw figures. In 2016, Mr. Speaker, the debt to GDP ratio stood at 60.9%. 60.9%. Now these figures are fascinating, Mr. Speaker. And I pause to ask, who was the Minister of Finance in 2015, going into 2016? One. But Mr. Speaker, the reality is that when you look at the figure of 60.9%, St. Lucia had virtually satisfied the benchmark of the debt to GDP ratio of 60% set by the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. The Eastern Caribbean Central Bank set a benchmark of 60% for the debt to GDP ratio of its member countries. And when I left office in 2016, St. Lucia had basically achieved that benchmark of 60.9%. And I don't care whether they're saying it's because it was rebased or it was not rebased. The reality is that, yes, but the reality is that I handed over to the member from Migu South an economy that was strong, an economy that had returned to growth, and a debt profile that was accommodating, Mr. Speaker. Now, of course, you know why? Because Hurricane Allen took over the reins of the Ministry of Finance. You destroyed it. That's why. That's why I'm telling you, you had that growth rate and you couldn't understand when we on this side drew your attention to I remember the arguments well. When we drew to your attention that the economy was decelerating, when we told you so, you know what the argument was? I remember the member, you remember the member for ancillary canneries? No, I will not say that word now. He went way back in time to develop a profile that we were disasters, but that's the reality. That's what they inherited. Now, let us turn to the former administration led by the member from Migu South. Listen to this. Good news. In 2017, the debt to GDP ratio was 58.8%. You're shouting out rebase, you'll get in trouble, you know. Your fella, you don't hear, you know. Upadi Satima. He shouts, the member for Castries North says rebase. 2018, it climbs slightly, 59.4%. 2019, 60.3%. By 2020, with the onset of COVID, climbs to 98.1%. And then in 2021, we see a slight decline to 85.9%. But wait, we haven't even added, I suspect, the drawdowns yet for the Hiwanora International Airport. But leave that alone for the time being. Currently, Mr. Speaker, as we speak, the debt-GDP ratio stands at 69.8%, according to the pronouncements of the Minister of Finance and what is contained in this Economic and Social Review. Again, Mr. Speaker, I pause to say that the COVID pandemic took its toll. And no doubt the dramatic increase in the debt-to-GDP ratio in 2020 was not just the result of heavy borrowing, but also the shrinking of growth in the economy. So two things were occurring. We began to borrow heavily, ostensibly to finance the fallout from COVID, and all of us know what the money was used for and what it was not used for, and I leave that for the other members to explore. And at the same time, you also had the shrinking of growth in the economy, ballooning, of course, your debt-to-GDP ratio. But I want to make 2 points. 2 points. First, the figures show that debt under the SLP was decelerating. That's the reality. Debt under UWP, while initially declining, began accelerating, takeoff. The takeoff mode, as the member for Labrie would say, the aircraft is at the end of the runway. The engines are revving up in preparation for takeoff. That's what's happening. That's the management of the member for Miku South. Secondly, debt-GDP ratios change as growth changes. So as the economy returned to growth in 2022, the debt-GDP ratios improved, and today is recorded at 69.8%. That explains why it is at 69.8%. Now,
As a result of the hurricane.
yes, let us take a look at the fiscal balances, the third criteria. Mr. Speaker, for your guidance and that of honorable members, I ask that you take a look at the Economic and Social Review at page 112. For ease of reference, I will only take one criterion, the overall balance. I will not go into the other balances. In 2021, the overall balance plunged to minus 112. Overall balance plunged to minus 12%, 12.2%, again the worst in the OECS. Why? I leave that question for the jury. But there's another key criterion that has to be employed in making this comparison and this measurement. Before we're going to arrive at a conclusion, it is this: which political party is responsible for the greatest wastages that have occurred in our economy? Now, they will tell you I have my sins. They will tell you. First of all, they will shout, Rochamel, Rochamel. And you know, they will shout, Rochamel, Rochamel, Rochamel. They will shout that. Yes, my government guaranteed $14.5 million to save the Den Hotel. And today, the hundreds who are employed there, they will shout that. They will shout that. The other one they shout about is Green Book, but we're reaching a point where we'll be able to talk about that. We ain't far from that. We're getting there. Because I've kept my silence over the years on that issue, but we're getting there, Mr. Speaker. We're getting there. Then, of course, they will tell you about cost overruns in the Beaufort Soufrière Road, the highway. And no matter how you know, Mr. Speaker, those cost overruns were transparent, measured by all and sundry. A commission of inquiry was even set up to investigate cost overruns and blah, 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 blah. You know the history of that. But consider the legacy of the former administration, some which have been itemized on previous debates in this House, and I'm only going to mention some. Look at the Lockerbie contract.
Oh my God.
31 million. And I am happy that the people of Beaufort rejected the turf that Lockerbie put elsewhere on other fields. At one time, the Beaufort South persons were adamant that no turf of that nature would be placed on its playing field in Beaufort. We have already explored the construction, the alternative hospital, the construction of the box. 118 million has gone, and God knows how much more is going to go into that box for the foreseeable future, but $118 million gone down the drain. Then, of course, the payment of the money to range. The Minister of Finance has already pointed out the cost overruns of, I believe, $40 million US on piles. Isn't it US? On piles for the new terminal building at Hiwanora. We have the payment of the US $7 million for COVID vaccines. And Mr. Speaker, then we have the $4.6 million. $4.6 million to Narayan for commissioning the OKU hospital. As I said, there's a $7 million for radical investment, the Lockerbie $32 million, and who can ever forget the payment of $3 million to Ernst & Young for budget preparation. Who can ever forget those things? All attributable, and I'm not going to get personal and mention anything about hotel room and how much hotel room costs, Mr. Speaker. You see, Mr. Speaker, see this man here? I used to get a lot of pressure from my cabinet, you know, Mr. Speaker. A lot of pressure. And I don't say this in any malice. I'll tell you this. There was a rule in my cabinet that all members travel economy class. If on the arrival at the airport of the Prime Minister that the airline wanted to upgrade the Prime Minister, they upgrade the Prime Minister. And I have often had the indignity. They would give me an upgrade from Hiwanora International Airport to my destination, but when you see I'm coming back, crap will smoke my pipe. Woe be unto me if I travel on British Airways.
Oh my God, yes.
Woe be. British Airways don't know anything about upgrade. But I would say that the other airline was a little kinder in that regard and often made sure that they provided I'm talking about Virgin. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to go into the specifics, but I will also tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the members of my cabinet were furious that they had to travel in the economy, and they would tease when there were moments of levity in the cabinet how, and I'm not talking out of cabinet, they would tease how they would have to sit next to the toilets in the long flights. In the long flights. Yeah. I didn't have the luxury that the former member had. I never had credit card to use in my life. So when you look at all of this, what is the verdict do you draw? Do I have to spell out the verdict? Do you have to spell out the verdict? Surely the answer is lucidly clear, absolutely clear. What more variation, what more argument do you want? The St. Lucian Labour Party has been beyond now the best manager of the St. Lucian economy by far. We have always been courageous and never resigned from taking the tough but right actions with the economy. People know my views on VAT. I made statements about VAT. I did not recoil when the day came and it had to be implemented. And my goodness, remember the blows that I took for it? That's what matters. You got to be courageous. And when the times comes for you to make powerful and strong decisions for your country, you mustn't be afraid. You have to do it for your country because your country